When my father crossed the border at El Paso in 1924 and enlisted in the United States 7th Cavalry Band, he probably did not know that he had just signed up with the luckiest band in all the splendid history of military music. I'll explain that a bit later. Among all the implements of human warfare, the drum and the horn are two of the oldest. The role of musicians in warfare from the dawn of recorded history is documented in historical writings and artwork, including sculptures and fresco. But first you might well ask, what the hell are musicians doing on battlefields in the first place? The degree of organization and the types of musical instruments used by military bands has varied throughout history, but military musicians have shared common roles. One of the earliest was frightening the enemy. How did that work? Well, until recent times, the world was normally a very quiet place. The most common sounds were nature's gentle background, the human voice, and noises made by simple tools. So when ordinary people were thrust onto ancient battlefields, and enemies howling, banging of shields, blaring of horns, and thumping of drums could have a terrifying effect. It was only logical to howl, bang, and blare back at them. Roman military musicians used horns for a more important purpose on the field of combat. Their horns transmitted orders from commanders to lower-ranking units and coordinated tactical movements from unit to unit. This was important because verbal commands have only a limited range and can be lost in the noise and confusion of the battlefield. Visual signals, such as waving flags, require a clear line of sight. That line can be blocked by hilly terrain or obscured by weather conditions. Military musicians have always played ceremonial roles, leading triumphant marches and landmark military events. The Romans did not use drums. Their exclusive use of horns influenced European military music until the era of the Crusades. Pipes and horns, but not drums, were used in Europe for regal ceremonial purposes as well as military functions. When Christian crusaders traveled to the Near East to confront their Muslim enemies, they were in for a shock. The Saracens they fought had not only introduced the use of bands on the battlefield itself, but had equipped them with plenty of drums. Big, loud drums. Austrian and Hungarian armies also heard the power of drums when they defended Vienna against the Ottoman Empire in 1529. The thunderous sounding of those drums was new and terrifying, but it was also inspiring. The influence of what came to be known as Turkish drums changed the nature of military bands forever. Those bands, in turn, influenced the development of civilian music. The sounds of fifes and drums were an important part of the history of colonial America and the Revolutionary War. Even before the Revolution, colonials were entertained by the sights and sounds of British troops marching in parades and playing at ceremonial functions. Drums had an important role in the training of new recruits. Marching in good order to the sound of drum beats was not just something that made the troops look good on parade. It was essential to the coordination of broad field maneuvers that were characteristic of that era of warfare. Until the late 19th century, field musicians accompanied the troops into the battle. The rhythmic sound of the drums kept troops in an orderly line of battle, and the music boosted morale by promoting a sense of unit identity and focusing attention on something other than the possibility of being struck by a musket ball. By the time of the American Civil War, a distinction had arisen between military bands and field musicians. Military bands accompanied troops to the front and provided entertainment to soldiers far from home. But it was the field musicians, the little drummer boys, who accompanied the troops into the withering ranks of fire. There were, however, a few instances during the Civil War when military bands did join the action. General William Armstrong Custer's band was one of them. Which brings us back to the luck of the 7th Cavalry Band during the genocidal war on Native Americans in the late 19th century. Military historians and social activists are still exchanging verbal fire over the causes and meaning of the massacre of Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, the 7th Cavalry Band did participate in at least some of Custer's other attacks on Native Americans. But just before the Battle of Little Bighorn, it was decided that the band's horses were needed for the armed cavalry. The band dismounted and marched back on foot to the post before the final battle. In any case, the nature of the battlefield was changing. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was probably the last major conflict in which massed ranks of troops accompanied by musicians confronted each other on the open field. The First World War ended all of that. Modern warfare in all its furious savagery swept field musicians off the battlefield. Machine guns and heavy artillery made open movement foolish and deadly. It took several years of sending hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths for the generals to figure this all out. But there would never again be a time when fifes and drums marched onto a battlefield within the ranks of soldiers. What do bands do during war when they are not playing a concert or in a parade? They still have important roles in support of combat troops. These might include, for example, sentry duty, guarding prisoners of war, and controlling traffic. And at times, they have had no choice but to take up arms, as happened to several Army bands during the Battle of the Bulge in the Second World War. In the next episode, we'll tell the story of one of my father's dangerous adventures in Panama while a bandsman. It's a story about which I was skeptical until I found proof of his story in the military records of the National Archives. Join us for the story of Indiana Diaz in Panama in the next episode of Fire and Ice.